In 2021, Airbus handed its biggest short-haul customer a monopoly it never asked for, not because it wanted to, because it had no other move left on the board. Think about what that actually means. One of the most powerful companies in aerospace, a manufacturer that controls half the global aircraft market, accidentally backed itself into a corner, and in doing so handed its rival an entire market segment, not through a bad product, not through a failed technology, through a single strategic miscalculation that nobody saw coming until it was already done. This isn't a story about who built the better plane. Airbus, Boeing, and Europe's biggest low-cost carriers were all playing the same game. The problem is that Airbus thought it was playing chess, while everyone else was playing something else entirely. This wasn't a market shift. It was checkmate, and once you see how it happened, the entire short-haul aviation story looks completely different. But to understand how Airbus lost, you first need to understand what it was protecting. In 2010, the short-haul market was the most stable battlefield in commercial aviation. 2 planes, 2 manufacturers, the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737, the 2 best-selling aircraft programs ever built. Between them, they owned every major low-cost route on the planet. Airlines played both sides deliberately. An order placed with Boeing was pressure on Airbus. A delivery slot with Airbus was leverage over Boeing. It was coldly rational, precisely balanced. Every billion-dollar decision made with a calculator, not a feeling. Then Airbus launched the A320neo. Same plane, new engines, 20% less fuel burn, and not a single extra day of pilot training required. It was the perfect move in a 2-player game. The short-haul market was the most efficiently contested battleground in commercial aviation. Then Airbus tried to add a third piece to a 2-player game. The move that started everything looked, on paper, like a bargain. Bombardier, a Canadian manufacturer, had spent $6 billion building the C-Series, a brand new aircraft designed to carry between 100 and 150 passengers on short, thin routes that the A320 and 737 were simply too large to serve profitably. The problem was that Bombardier was running out of money. So in 2018, Airbus bought a controlling stake in the entire program for $1 for a $6 billion aircraft program. The logic made sense on the surface. Airbus would rename it the A220, plug the gap below the A320, and capture a segment Boeing had walked away from years earlier. More routes, more customers, more market share. But there was a cost buried inside that deal that no press release mentioned. Every airline that wanted the A220 would need new simulators, new maintenance contracts, and new pilot certifications. At a moment when every airline on Earth was cutting complexity just to survive, Airbus didn't just add an aircraft. It added a bill that every airline would have to pay before they flew a single passenger. 3 players, 3 completely different problems. Airbus needed the A220 to become a category-defining aircraft. Not a niche product for regional routes, but a genuine third pillar of its entire short-haul business. The fear keeping Airbus executives up at night was simple. If the A220 failed, $6 billion worth of Bombardier's work would become a write-off that damaged the A320 program's reputation by association. Boeing, remarkably, had no real answer in this segment. The 737-7 MAX existed on paper, but airlines weren't ordering it in meaningful numbers. Boeing's fear was quiet but serious. If the A220 succeeded with the right customers, Boeing would have a gap in its portfolio that could take a decade to fix. And then there were the low-cost carriers, Ryanair, EasyJet, Indigo. These airlines built their entire business model on one principle: simplicity. Every pilot flies the same aircraft. Every mechanic knows the same engine. A new aircraft type doesn't just add complexity, it attacks the foundation the whole operation is built on. They controlled the order volumes that determined whether the A220's unit cost ever dropped low enough to compete seriously. And they knew it. Airbus needed the low-cost carriers. The low-cost carriers didn't need Airbus to need them. In 2016, Bombardier signed its first major deal, 75 aircraft with Delta Airlines. Boeing's response was immediate. It filed a complaint with the U.S. government claiming Bombardier was selling the C-Series below cost to undercut American manufacturers. The proposed tariffs hit 300%. Overnight, the most valuable aviation market in the world was effectively closed. Then Airbus made its first real move. By acquiring the program and opening an assembly line in Mobile, Alabama, the tariffs disappeared. American-assembled aircraft couldn't be taxed as foreign imports. Problem solved, on paper. But between 2019 and 2021, every major European low-cost carrier said the same thing. Not yet. EasyJet, operating 337 Airbus aircraft. Declined. Ryanair didn't engage. Wizz Air stayed with the A321neo, but here's what most coverage quietly skips past. Airbus's real problem wasn't the aircraft. It was timing. And timing in aviation is everything. Then COVID grounded between 60 and 70% of global capacity. Every airline deferred orders, cut costs, and simplified wherever possible. An aircraft requiring a separate pilot certification became exactly the commitment no airline would make in a crisis. And when travel recovered and airlines desperately needed new capacity, Airbus's own A320neo backlog had stretched to 18 to 24 months. Airlines needed aircraft now, so they ordered what their pilots already knew how to fly. The window closed before it ever fully opened. By 2023, the A220 had collected over 800 orders. On the surface, that sounds like progress. But look at where those orders came from and the picture changes completely. Delta, Air France, Swiss, Korean Air, full-service carriers with the training budgets and operational flexibility to absorb a new aircraft type. Not a single order from the top 5 European low-cost carriers. The airlines whose volume would have driven production costs down enough to make the program genuinely competitive. Airbus now had 2 short-haul products serving 2 completely separate markets, with no overlap between them and no bridge connecting them. The A320neo family dominated one side. The A220 quietly served the other, and between those 2 markets sat a gap, the sub-165-seat segment that low-cost carriers actually needed. Boeing hadn't outmaneuvered anyone. It had simply stayed still while Airbus moved away from its own territory. The 737 MAX became the default choice not because it was the best option available, but because it was the only familiar one left standing. Airbus didn't lose the short-haul market. They subdivided it so precisely that they handed Boeing a segment by walking away from it. Here is where the theory meets the runway. Airbus projected the A220 would break even at around 300 total deliveries. By mid-2024, 8 years after the aircraft's first flight, total deliveries across every operator worldwide sat at approximately 270, still below the break-even line, still losing money on every aircraft that left the factory. At the same time, the A320neo family reached 10,000 orders faster than any commercial aircraft in history. Airbus's core short-haul product was stronger than it had ever been. The demand was real, the growth was real, just not where Airbus had been trying to push it. The gap between those 2 numbers tells the whole story. Airbus built an aircraft the market technically wanted, but it structured the program in a way that its most powerful potential buyers simply could not absorb. A new pilot type rating costs an airline between $30,000 and $40,000 per pilot. For a low-cost carrier running 5,000 flights every month on a single aircraft type, fleet standardization isn't an operational preference. It is the foundation the entire business is built on. Asking them to add a new aircraft type isn't asking them to make a purchase. It is asking them to rebuild their operation from the inside. The aircraft was ready. The market wasn't structured to receive it. But here is where the story turns. While Europe's low-cost carriers kept their distance, a different kind of airline was paying close attention. Air France-KLM had no low-cost operation to protect, no single-type fleet to preserve, no training pipeline that a new aircraft would break. What they had was a network full of thin routes that the A320 was too large and too expensive to serve profitably. They placed an order for 60 confirmed aircraft, with 60 more on option. It wasn't a bold expansion play, it was a lifeline, and both sides knew it. Delta told the same story from across the Atlantic. On domestic American routes where a 737 or A320 would have flown half empty and lost money on every seat, the A220 changed the calculation entirely. Fewer seats, lower operating costs, and enough passenger comfort to protect the fare. On those specific routes, the A220 didn't just perform well. It was the only aircraft that made the numbers work at all. Airbus didn't dominate short-haul. But the airlines that actually put the A220 into service discovered something Airbus had promised and genuinely delivered. An aircraft that didn't just serve existing routes more efficiently, but made previously unprofitable routes viable for the first time. That is a different kind of victory, smaller than Airbus planned, but real. The winner in short-haul aviation was never decided by who had the better aircraft. It was decided by who understood that for a low-cost carrier, the airplane is not the product. The schedule is. Airbus built something technically impressive. The A220 burns less fuel, carries passengers more comfortably on short routes, and opens city pairs that larger aircraft can't serve profitably. None of that was wrong. What was wrong was the assumption that the market's most powerful buyers would reorganize their entire operation around a better product. They wouldn't. And they didn't. The A220 is not a failure. It is a product that found a different market than the one it was built to capture. That distinction matters. A failed gambit means the idea was bad. A misread market means the idea was right but aimed at the wrong target. Airbus built the right aircraft for the wrong customer. And by the time the right customers appeared, the window for dominance had already closed. The real lesson is simpler than it looks. In aviation, the leverage always sits with whoever controls the training pipeline. Type ratings are not a technical footnote. They are the moat. And Airbus asked its most powerful potential customers to cross that moat at the worst possible moment in the industry's recent history. And if you think Airbus's miscalculation was costly, wait until you see what Boeing did with the aircraft that was supposed to replace the 737 altogether. That story involves a plane that never flew, a decision made in a boardroom in 2004, and a gap in Boeing's portfolio that still hasn't been filled.